Nick, do you have anything to add to that?
Nope. It's hopefully going to be really good. I'm looking forward to it, and I'll be spreading the word as much as I can, try to get as many people out to it.
All right. Well, with no further ado, we've invited Nick from RWU and other railroaders to speak from their perspective about long trains. And what we want to try to impress upon people that maybe aren't railroaders is it's not the railroader's fault, and it creates a safety issue for everybody involved, whether they're blocked crossings or whether they're just ridiculously long trains with a lot of hazardous chemicals in it. There's an art and science to putting trains together that a lot of, people don't know about. And so what we're hoping to do by sharing this information from a railroader's point of view is let more folks understand how complicated it is behind the scenes from a worker's point of view, and some of the issues they face as railroad workers. So Nick, I'm gonna let you take it away. I'm gonna scan through the chat. If y'all have questions, please drop them in the chat, and I'm gonna try to facilitate that. And we'll do questions at the end. All right?
All right. Yeah, so I think the important thing to try to answer in this discussion is not just um, identifying the problem and educating folks who aren't as familiar about what the problem is and all the complexities. I think the really important thing at the end is what are we going to do about it? And what does public ownership have to do with any of this? I think that's the key question here. And I think the really short answer is that all of the attempts so far to mitigate the dangers of long and heavy trains have not worked. Um, whether it's efforts from regulatory agencies or whether it's leaving the industry up to regulate itself or whether it's sort of electing the right politicians, it hasn't worked. Um, I think for a lot of people, their first exposure to the idea of overly long and heavy trains is the East Palestine disaster and the aftermath of that. After the East Palestine disaster, derailments continued to get reported in the media, and sort of the size of these trains that were derailing was a constant feature of discussion. How many miles they are, how many tons, the fact that the way the train was built in the East Palestine disaster, for example, contributed to making the derailment even worse than if it had been built differently. Um, and all of that's continued. So even just the last 2 months, RWU's put out a couple of special bulletins related to, of course, the ongoing attempt from Union Pacific to buy Norfolk Southern. In March, Union Pacific had five major derailments. And then in April, they had six more derailments. And, to illustrate the scale of some of these, and some of these, the information isn't out there to say like how long and how heavy these trains are specifically. But the April 4th one that happened east of Tucson, that was 14,500 feet of train. Um, in April 23rd in Austin, Texas, it was a 230 car intermodal train. These are massive. Um, Part of the problem when when we're talking about this stuff is not all cars are built equally, especially when it comes to like intermodal cars and things like that. What's technically one car could be the length of five other cars. Um, so when we're talking about what's a long and heavy train, the important thing is the length and the tonnage. And one of the challenging things is that the railroads aren't required to report length and tonnage. And so the data for all of this stuff is not there. And that's a huge black hole in the fight against long and heavy trains because the railroads are able to manipulate the idea of what is an average size train to make it sound not that bad, right? 5,000 feet, 7,000 feet. That's not that bad. That's a average size train. But the problem is the really long trains that, are obscured in the calculation of the average by, short little local jobs that have, who knows, 20 cars, are a couple thousand feet long. Um, that are being run more and more regularly and getting longer and longer. And these are the ones that when they derail, the derailments are catastrophic and the consequences last for years, really. So I think as a starting point to the idea of what does public ownership have to do with this is that we have to understand that the reason that long and heavy trains are getting longer and heavier and being utilized more and more frequently ever since the quote unquote precision scheduled railroading revolution is that it all comes back to the profit motive. For the railroads, running longer and heavier trains from their calculations and from the way they see the world, it saves on fuel costs, it saves on cost of maintaining a locomotive fleet, it saves on labor costs. Um, and through all of this math and all of this narrative that they craft for the shareholders, long and heavy trains are part of the overall goal of getting the operating ratio down, extracting more profit out of the railroads, turning them into sort of modern railroads that generate more profit. So this was part of Hunter, um, Jesus Christ,
Under Harrison.
Hunter Harrison's precision scheduled railroading model that, got pushed in the 2010s and has been adopted universally throughout the industry. So let's talk a little bit about the technical side of things without hopefully getting boring and into the weeds, because I think it's important to say that we don't need to know all of the technical details here in order to make the case about why a train that is longer and heavier than others is more dangerous. I think to a certain extent, it's common sense, right? For most people, the idea of navigating a steep grade with a longer and heavier train is inherently more dangerous. A longer and heavier train with more hazmat in it is more dangerous. Um, but we have to talk about it not just in isolation, because this is one of the things that the industry does, and that the corporations do when they talk about long and heavy trains, is that they say there is no evidence to suggest that long and heavy trains are more dangerous, basically. And what they do is, they can basically make an argument that given perfect conditions, you can run a longer and heavier train just as safely. The problem is that it removes it from the broader context of what's going on in the industry and all the related cuts and things like that that the carriers are moving forward with, that makes the prospect of running a longer and heavier train even more dangerous. So let's just go through some basics. Um, it's not just dangerous to workers, it's dangerous to trackside communities, people who use crossings, who live next to tracks, and it's dangerous to the environment. So with a long and heavy train, it takes more time to break the train, to stop the train. All of the physics of how a train works uh, get magnified, which makes it more likely that a train derails, that when it derails, it is a catastrophic derailment, that a train may break apart due to mechanical failure. Um, Long and heavy trains have more problems with braking in imperfect conditions, especially when it's cold and air pressure becomes a big factor. In general, they're harder to run from the perspective of the train crew. And then when things go wrong, things go really wrong. Even when they don't catastrophically go wrong, even if you just have like a defect or something like that that you have to correct. Now, instead of it being, maybe maximum 50 cars back, maybe maximum a mile back in your train. Now the conductor's having to walk 2 miles back to find the defect and repair it. And now you're looking at multiple hours of delays on the main line. Um, but also, longer and heavier trains are more difficult to inspect. Before a train leaves its originating terminal, it's supposed to get a mechanical inspection from qualified mechanical employees, car inspectors who are looking for things that need to be repaired, cars that are unsafe to move, cars that need to get kicked out of the train, or parts that need to get replaced before the train leaves. And the problem is, maybe you could have inspected, a mile long train in a certain amount of time. But now, if you're assembling trains that are 2, 3 miles long, and you're under the gun to get those trains out of the terminal as quickly as possible in order to make the shareholders happy, in order to make the numbers look good, for local management, who's all, under the gun from their bosses. Uh, Now the likelihood of catching all of those mechanical faults or fixing them um, goes down drastically, especially once you consider that there are now terminals where they've drastically cut the number of mechanical employees that work there to inspect cars, or even locomotives. People may remember a couple of years back there was a big story that broke about the fact that Union Pacific, inspections of Union Pacific's locomotive fleet revealed that it was something like 70% of their locomotives were carrying FRA reportable defects, right? So even setting aside the question of cars, the locomotives that are being used to move these trains are not being maintained to the same standard that they used to be. And that sort of magnifies the chance of things going wrong. Um, and so you can see how it's not just a question of are long and heavy trains a danger in isolation. It's also that everything that makes them dangerous is being made more dangerous by cuts to not just train crews, but to all of the other crafts that work on the railroad. And then cuts to things like track maintenance, the growing use of automated systems to inspect track, to inspect cars, the growing use of automated systems to actually run the trains themselves, um, which contributes to a big factor here, which is that if under ideal circumstances, it's okay to run a long and heavy train because you have a train crew that is properly trained and prepared and equipped to be able to run a long and heavy train. With the growing use of automation to actually run trains, you have effectively a workforce that's being de-skilled. When the computer is running the train for you, that's time spent, or that's time that the locomotive engineer is not spending learning how to manipulate the train, and gaining experience with running long and heavy trains. And so when things go wrong and it's thrown back to manual control, or when a locomotive operator is asked to run a long and heavy train that they haven't done before, they're not properly equipped to be able to deal with that. And again, it's not their fault. It's as the industry pushes the sort of the automation in order to save on fuel, in order to ultimately, with the goal of removing the having to pay a locomotive engineer, and the goal of zero to zero PTC, basically the idea of um, pushing a start button and the train's going to run itself from start to stop. Um, that's their end goal. And along the way, it's de-skilling the workforce. And all of the new hires that are coming into the industry are not being trained to the same standard that we used to be. Um, so, and, to add a bit more of the context, one of the things about long and heavy trains is not just the total length and the total weight, but also where the weight is in the train. Part of the idea of how to build a train is the idea of marshaling it and putting the heavy stuff at the front where you're going to be able to uh, apply the brakes sooner, where it's not going to run in on top of a bunch of empties when you're descending a grade, for example. And so, with the driving force of these metrics that are being used to make the industry look good to the shareholders and prop up the stock prices, the idea of things like dwell time, and how long cars sit in yards before they make their way out puts yard masters and managers and the people who build and assemble trains puts them under significant pressure to move freight as quickly as possible and restart the clock on it as quickly as possible. And what happens is that best practices that are have been developed over, hundreds of years of running trains get thrown out the window in the name of trying to move stuff more quickly. And that's ignoring the problem of when you're assembling a longer than normal train, all of the difficulties and all of the time it takes to get that train together and get it out of the terminal means everything takes longer. Assembling the train takes longer, pumping it up takes longer, inspecting it takes longer, and there's more and more pressure to get the trains out as quickly as possible. But the trains themselves are taking longer to assemble and longer to move. Um, so, all of this is to say that long and heavy trains are a huge danger, not just to railroad workers, but to the broader communities. And it's a known problem. There was a really excellent series of articles that were written by ProPublica a few years back, where they were investigating the railroad industry after in the aftermath of East Palestine. And they did an excellent report titled "Why Long and Heavy Trains Derail," or something like that. You can find it on their website under the heading "Train Country," and I'm sure we can send it out to folks. Um, and that's a couple years old now. But one of the things it does is it traces and it gives really concrete examples of where long and heavy trains and derailments due to trains being overly long and heavy had been a known problem in the industry, not just to the companies, but also to regulatory bodies for decades leading up to the East Palestine derailment, and how the FRA and had not done enough in order to basically bring the railroads to heel and block or discourage the use of overly long and heavy trains. And this comes to a big sort of fundamental problem with all of this is uh, the current head of the FRA is a former railroad executive. And the railroads spend a huge amount of money on buying politicians and lobbying politicians who ultimately make the decisions about who is going to staff these regulatory bodies. Um, and so what we have is we have an industry that has a profit motive to keep running longer and heavier trains, that is also spending a ton of money and a ton of political resources to ensure that their ability to continue to run long and heavy trains is protected, and is not sort of infringed on by any kind of regulation. And they use all kinds of methods. They use the idea that the federal government is the only body that has, due to interstate commerce, the only body that has the ability to regulate train length. They use that to try and preempt state by state measures. But even when, states try to take action on this stuff, what happens when and if those states change hands from political administration to political administration and regulations get rolled back, and things get undermined. So, a great example of this was during the pandemic, the railroad successfully lobbied to get the basically the expiration window for air brake inspections to be increased from 4 hours to 24 hours. Uh, uh, and they explicitly said it's going to save us a ton of money by not having to do as many inspections of the air brake systems of trains. And it's going to allow us to cut people and resources and locomotives. And so even regulations that have developed as a result of blood are not safe and can be rolled back. So I think this gets me to the conclusion, um, which is again, what does public ownership have to do with this? So we have to go back to the fundamental reason why they're running long and heavy trains because of the profit motive. Their motivation is not to move freight uh, as safely and efficiently as possible. Their motivation is to move freight as cheaply as possible, and also to maximize value, to cut all expenses that they possibly can, in order to make maximum profit. And so that's where public ownership comes into it, in my opinion, is if we're going to try to rationalize the way that the railroad system works, we have to be making decisions not based on what is profitable, but based on what's safe. And so long as the profit motive is the governing law of how decisions are made for the industry, then that's not going to be the case. It is never, there's always, anytime the question of safety comes up, there's a dollar sign attached to it. In order to do things safely, you can't do things cheaply. Um, and I think the second question is when it comes to regulation, the idea of whether public democratic control of the industry would give railroad workers and communities more control and more ability to directly make rules than the current regulatory and legislative process. And I raise this, and I want to raise this as a really concrete example. Um, we were invited to France 2 years ago um, by French railroad workers. And one of the things I was blown away by when we met with them, and it just happened to come up in discussions, was that there's a limit on how long trains can be in France, and it's there to ensure, that trains will be able to fit anywhere in the country, any yard, any siding, right? Which is a huge problem in the United States, where so much of our rail industry was built when trains were, a mile long was a massive train. A mile and a half long was a massive train. And so the sidings and the yards were built to handle trains of those size. And now we have trains that are, you know, 2 times that length regularly, and they don't fit. They block crossings. They take forever to get into the yard and out of the yard and things like that. And one of the reasons that they explain that this train length limit in France has never been sort of rolled back is because the French railway system is publicly owned, and they have a structure where labor is at the table when it comes to decision making, rule making, and how operations are run in France. They have representatives on the governing bodies directly. And so I think that's a really important point. Now, in France, their fight is to defend the national railway system against ongoing attempts to privatize it and to roll back things like, that train length limit. Whereas here, our fight is for public ownership in the first place in order to basically enable us to be able to make those decisions and have railroad workers and trackside communities in charge of how the railroads run. Um, because at the end of the day, it's my opinion that the point of the railroads should be to move people and goods as safely and quickly and efficiently as possible. And the current system of private ownership does not share that same goal. The goal is to move what freight you can as profitably as you can, and actually to shed freight if possible, if it's not making enough money, if there's not enough of a profit in it. So we have fundamentally different goals and fundamentally different visions of what the point of the industry is. And so that's where Public Rail Now comes into it, in my opinion. So I'll stop there. I've been blabbing for long enough.
Well, thank you, Nick. I've got a few so there's a couple questions, but first I'm going to see if maybe Jeff Kurtz, Ron Kamenkow, Fred Naden, Jacob Fund, or Tom White have anything to say. Those are the railroaders I wrote down. Forgive me if I didn't catch anybody else who's a railroader.
I could write a book about the subject. Oh, wait, yes. Yeah, let's see if the other guys want to go, and then I have some points.
Ron?
I'll be glad to go late in the going. What I want to say is only about the situation in New York City and certain regulatory problems there with the publicly owned roads.
All right, so it'll be Ron, and then we'll pitch it to Fred.
Okay. Thanks, Tabitha, and thank you, Nick, for such a great presentation that touched on just about all the bases. I want to talk a little bit about the inefficiencies of these long, heavy trains. I worked for Conrail in the 90s. We were gobbled up by Norfolk Southern, at least the portion that I worked for in 99. A long train for us back in them days was definitely 10,000 feet. I mean, that was super, super long. And now that's not the longest train for sure. I went to Amtrak 20 years ago, so I saw the whole thing from a totally different perspective. These long trains, especially since PSR, delayed my train endlessly. Um, the inefficiencies of long trains, I mean, there are endless examples. And the railroad likes to tout how efficient they are. Well, they're efficient in terms of saving the railroad money, lowering the operating ratio, boosting the stock price, and so forth. But they're incredibly inefficient in terms of all sorts of other metrics, like when a long train can't fit into a siding, and here on the Nevada subdivision, the longest sidings we have generally are about 10,000 feet. And so the train can't fit. And so with Amtrak, we have to go into the siding and we crawl up to the signal while this train finally lumbers back up to speed and gets out of the way. But when two freight trains meet, it's unbelievably inefficient. Rolling meets are very efficient. And what that means is a train goes into the siding, it continues going at 10 or 20 miles an hour. The other train gets in, the signal clears up, and the freights go out the either end of the sidings at a reasonable speed. But when you have a long train meeting another long train, it's excruciating. And the engineer is approaching the signal at the east end of the siding, and the PTC is beeping, and it doesn't fit. And so it's called a no fitter, and it's hanging out the other end. So here comes your westbound train down the main, and it has to approach the red signal and squeeze in, maybe even come to a stop, but be crawling. So now you've taken two trains that are 10, 20,000 ton trains and brought them to a stop. Whereas if you could have kept the tonnage going, one of the efficiencies of rail is when you get up to speed, there's very little friction. And as any engineer can tell you, on flat territory, you can just run along in like notch one, hardly burning a lot of diesel fuel and maintain 50, 60, 70 miles an hour. But when these big, heavy monstrosities have to come to such a, a slow speed or even stop, every time you get a meet on single track, the amount of diesel fuel that is burned to get the train back up to 50, 60, or 70 miles an hour is a huge amount. And I would love to see this documented because occasionally the railroad gets a jag on about, oh, we got to save fuel, we got to save fuel because the price of diesel is now so high. Well, one of the ways to save fuel is not run such long, heavy trains, but that's just one example of the inefficiencies. The others, I mean, they're endless. I mean, they can't fit into a yard. For 2 years, Amtrak trains 5 and 6, the California Zephyr, had to go through the yard at Elko, incredibly dangerous with a loaded passenger train in the middle of the night, running through yard tracks because the super duper long trains that were brought about by precision scheduled railroading, UP didn't know how to handle them at Elko. And it was just this disgraceful display of chronic delay of 1, 2, 3 hours every night. And I knew this because I waited at Winnemucca for hours waiting for these trains to arrive. And of course, it was like the Elko black hole. And so somehow they managed to get that figured out in recent years. But for years, it was just this chronic delay because Elko was not built to handle these lengths of trains, and the Union Pacific does not want to invest in expanding the Elko yard tracks. And so, once again, complete and total inefficiency. And when these trains have problems, either because they break in two or they hit a hotbox detector, just a routine problem on single track, that train has now clogged up the entire railroad. Nothing can go east, nothing can go west for hours and hours. And the break is 2.5 miles away. So the conductor has to walk 2.5 miles to find the break now. Um, Obviously, in inclement weather, this could be a complete debacle. And we've been there, and you sit and you wait. Everything on the railroad comes to a complete stop for 4, 5, 6, 7 hours while they put this train back together or figure out what's wrong with it. And I could go on and on and on after 20 years of being an Amtrak engineer and being delayed by freight trains. I'm never going to be convinced that a long train is an efficient train. It's good for stockholders in the short run. In the long run, it eats up a huge amount of track capacity. It doesn't do a goddamn thing for fluidity. It angers lots and lots of shippers and customers because trains get delayed. They can't run on time. I actually read something called The Economics of Short Trains. It was written back in the 70s, and it's fascinating. And railroads like the Rio Grande, all the way up until it was taken over by First Southern Pacific, then Union Pacific in 95, ran lots and lots and lots of high horsepower ratio, three to one horsepower ratio, and were able to run this incredibly complex railroad with steep grades, short sidings, and canyons and twists and turns. And they managed to run an extremely profitable railroad. And how they do it? Because they ran short, fast trains. And I rest my case, but I'm a huge advocate of short, fast trains.
Thank you, Ron. Jacob, pitch it to you, and then we're going to go to Fred.
Right. That's why I have a small car, not like a giant gas guzzler truck. I just get more bang for my buck and with my small Toyota. But when I first started at the railroads, I remember the big ordeal was embargoing a station, which means that it would they would refuse any new inbound traffic because they had a big like jam at the station. And of course, as you would expect, when that got to the higher aboves, the higher echelons, and the board, they said absolutely not. The board will hate that because it's going to ruin, service. It's going to make us look bad. We can't allow this embargo to go on, and that stuck with me. That was like my first day at work in the office. I remember that was the deal. I'm like, oh, so what do we do then? It's just like, well, we have to think of something else, or and if they don't like it, then they might just change the numbers anyways. So another thing is I heard gas can bringing was brought up a lot. Yes, longer trains would save them gas, but the the railroads love when gas prices are high because they make a profit from that as well. So it's just to say that, yes, they're cutting on both sides there. And then I really like that the economics of short trains. Um, right now, the effort is to create this super train that goes from, Canada to Mexico and down. And they found that, well, what we need are just longer sidings. And we're going to build a whole bunch of longer sidings to accommodate this. And instead of going down the route that I think Ron mentioned. So that's what all of their infrastructure is really going into is just making longer sidings, which I think just makes the problem even bigger because you're just going to get bigger trains that have more of these horrible disasters that I've seen. It seems that what is it that you could like maybe people could speak about like the what is it, the AAR, the American Association of Railroads and whatnot, which is just basically the companies, to get together to just say that they're just the sensible, peaceful railroad organization that is nonpartisan, but they really just represent the organizations. And they try to standardize everything, try to standardize all the safety guidelines and whatnot. And it just feels like there needs to be a push to say, and I see like the ProPublica articles and what PRN and RWU are doing to create something that says something, an alternative message that they're saying, because they've kind of dictated the railroads, I guess, and maybe pushing against that and creating our own, human like safety measures and whatnot would be better. That would push out PSR and kind of debunk it I think a lot of this stuff has. But that's what I would say about a lot of this. And it's a great topic, and I would love to go on it more. But I think I've said enough. I've exhausted myself. So that's all.
Thank you, Jacob. Fred, and if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. You're on mute. Hold on.
How's it now?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. I worked on the public side, and it's better run, and some of the problems that have been mentioned don't exist. Where I worked, it was almost entirely electrical service, avoiding the problems caused by fuel-operated equipment. And in New York City, there is a very severe but carefully adjusted absolute length limit, and it varies according to the location in the city, the threat to the community, the sharpness of the curves, and all the obvious physical concerns. But even within the limit, long trains are dangerous. The first time I had to break couplers and use a maul to do it because they wouldn't break. The only other man involved in this movement of the cars was the operator, who was 17 cars away at the other end of Coney Island Yard and trying to help me a bit by jostling the train. And I was standing inches away from hot rail. This is how men die. And it never gets reported. Still less gets reported as a length problem. There's a good deal of bad news hidden in the rosy reports that even publicly operated railroads will give to excuse their carelessness, selfishness, and undermanning, for that's the most important problem. The destruction of the jobs, of the whole traditions and crafts, which is occurring slowly, but is occurring. The second thing to say is, even though there are problems in this publicly operated New York railway system, go to Jersey, right across the river, where it's a private system for freight. There's nothing to add to the complaints that the brothers have been making. It's the same in Jersey as in Nevada. It's just in the intense crowding of New York City with public ownership, it's somewhat different. New York State proves that public ownership will save lives reduce accidents, improve service, and help the environment, of course, because we're dealing with an electrically dominated system. There are some diesel runs left upstate, but New York State has a long-range plan to electrify them. All that's positive. The most positive thing about electrification is that if you live next door to it, it's going to be noisy as the blazes at certain hours, but it's never going to kill you. It's a huge improvement. Out on Long Island, we don't have it yet. I don't know why those rich folks out there don't want to have a safer place to live in, but they're damn fools not to have insisted on it. The Long Island strike, by the way, had nothing to do with any of these issues, even though the men and women operating on the Long Island Railroad are aware of them. And I know from my own time, several decades ago now, that they objected to them. This is a case where there's yet another problem of backward union leadership. And that's all.
Okay. Thank you, Fred. It's good to see you again. So Karen, I see your question in the chat. We'll save that one till last since it's not necessarily about the long trains directly. All right. Tom, I think you were next on stack. And give me a second to switch. I'm facilitating and doing all the back end stuff.
I am infinitely patient.
There we go.
Had to be to survive 28 years of being a train dispatcher. So I've got a bunch of notes here on what I've been hearing, and this isn't an organized rep, so I'm just going to go through stuff here as I've got the notes. So the first thing, train inspections. When you're a train dispatcher, you deal in time and distance. Those are your tools. So when a train has an emergency air brake application, could be a broken coupler, broken air hose, separated air hose. Nobody knows. Guys on the engine don't know. I figure 1 mile an hour for the guy to go inspect the train. If you're out walking on the sidewalk and just walking, a brisk walk is 4 miles an hour. So you're not going to walk 4 miles an hour in ballast and weeds. It might be 2. But you're looking under the train as you're walking along in the dark and the wind and tumbleweeds blowing against you and all that. So I've always figured once one of the trains I'm handling has stopped for some sort of a defect that's at the brakes, that the guy is going to be walking 1 mile an hour looking for it. So for a 7,000-foot train, which was the standard length train on BN when I was doing these things, it would take you 1 hour and 19 minutes to walk from one end to the other. On a 14,000-foot train, which in the days of PSR is not a long train, it takes 2 hours and 36 minutes. Now, in the days of caboose cars, when the air went, which means the brakes applied, a guy would get off in the back and walk up, and a guy would get off in the front and walk back. So they would find the defect in half the time. Now you got one poor guy on the engine who walks the entire length of the train. So just finding the problem can take as long as, for a 14,000-foot train, 2.5 hours. That's also the speed at which you need to inspect a train in the yard. So for a 14,000-foot train, if you don't have 2.5 hours, then you haven't had the time to inspect the train. But wait, car inspectors work in a 2-man crew, one on each side of the train, because to do a proper terminal air brake test, which is the test that is required before a train leaves where it's all been coupled together and turned into a train, you actually need to see the brakes on both sides, and you need to measure how far the cylinder that operates the air brakes moves to apply the brakes. So you're looking at a minimum for a car inspector, one person to inspect a 14,000 ton train of 5 hours. The guys will tell you they're not allowed 5 hours. That ain't going to happen. Let's see, blocking trains. There's not only the slack run-in problem where the big heavy train is pushing the light part in front. There's also the string line problem where the light cars are in the middle of the train. So you're going around a sharp curve. You've got a lot of tonnage behind some light cars. They'll just flop over towards the inside of the curve, and I bet you the guys are nodding their head at that. And then you have the situation of the engineer running the train is operating something that can be going uphill and downhill at the same time. If you work in the Midwest in hogback territory where it's up and down and up and down and up and down, a 15,000-foot train can actually be going uphill 3 different places in the train and downhill 3 different places in the train. The parts going downhill, the couplers are pushing against the car in front at the same time as the part that's going uphill is pulling. It is a nightmare to be a locomotive engineer. I've only been a locomotive engineer for a few short hours, but enough to know that it's a nightmare for a locomotive engineer. Let's see. Then there's the delays, and it's way more than the sidings because when a 60-mile-an-hour train has to go, let's say it's not going to be delayed because it's double track and it's going to go through a crossover. At 35-mile-an-hour typical crossover speed, a 7,000-foot train is going to take a 5-minute delay, which then propagates into delays for other trains if the railroad's crowded. 14,000-foot train doubles that. A longer train adds more time yet than that. So those are not safety problems themselves, but those are capacity and service problems. When you're on a 2-track railroad or even a single-track railroad where the freight trains fit in the sidings, this is part of your Amtrak delays, is dispatchers who have been inadequately trained in details such as figuring out when trains are going to be someplace, miscalculate or don't calculate the delay that can occur just going through a turnout. And then the safety aspect of a long train. The air brakes are operated by the engineer letting air out of a charged pipe from the engine. And the brake system detects the change in air pressure and then applies the brakes. When the engineer starts letting the air out in the engine, the reduction in pressure travels at 920 feet per second. You don't have to memorize that number. It's just how long it takes. So in a 7,000-foot train, it takes 10 seconds for the brakes to begin setting after the engineer has, on the rear car, after the engineer has started braking the head car. At 60 miles an hour, that train has gone 680 feet. So the rear end has gone 680 feet further than the front end. A 14,000-foot train, that turns into the rear end has moved 1,750 feet after the brakes have set on the engines and the first car. To see that in action, I put a link in of the derailment in Texas where a Union Pacific train hit a big piece of oil field equipment on a crossing. The cars just kept coming and coming and coming and coming after the front end stopped. Pay attention to how much that train keeps on going. And just picture that if you only had a 7,000 foot train, that the momentum behind it would be half of that, and it would pretty much limit how long the cars keep on going. Then there's the false economy of longer trains. So the state of Washington, I had convinced the state of Washington, the legislature, back in 2010. We had so many freight opponents to the Sounder commuter rail and the Amtrak Cascades, and it was going to cause just horrible disruption on the entire West Coast. Passenger trains would bankrupt Burlington Northern and all the ports and everything else. And I made a drawing and had it sent to the legislature that depicted the north-south double track CTC line between Everett and Portland as a fire hydrant with garden hoses coming off of it, and pointed out to the legislature, your problem is garden hoses, not the passenger trains and the fire hydrant. So we did a study, and they hired a big engineering company, Cambridge Systematics, because of their name, to lead the study. And their method was to ask the railroad if there were any problems, and the railroad said no. Anything that is that we need more capacity, we'll just run longer trains. So I did the homework on the longer trains. As Ron pointed out, the longer trains reduce capacity because they don't fit in the sidings. The longer trains don't fit on a yard track. So there's a process called doubling or tripling or quadrupling, where the train is disassembled into several tracks in order to fit, and assembled in several tracks in order to fit. Because they didn't fit when they go out on the main line after they're put together, they still have to test the air brakes. They have occupied mainline capacity no other train can use. Then, of course, they don't fit in the sidings. And I don't figure things like, as Jeff mentioned, double sawbys and stupid stuff like that. When I figure capacity, I figure capacity which involves where the trains fit. So when I did that, considering the mainline capacity that was lost to trains going in and out of yards, the mainline capacity that was lost through slowing down for switches, the main track capacity that was lost because the trains didn't fit in the sidings, I found out that when they run their longer trains, they actually ran less freight tonnage. They actually moved less freight with the longer trains. Nobody would believe that. So even though I did all the homework, it was not popular. It didn't get published in the study, but I did the homework and turned it in anyway. The one last thing is I am a proponent of doing something, and government ownership could be a solution. It could be a part of a solution. However, government ownership is not a panacea. And when you talk about the labor aspect of what's happening in government ownership, remember that in 1980, the air traffic controller strike started in Aurora, Illinois, right near where I lived, because of working conditions, not because of pay. Pay was secondary. Well, if you're going to make us work this way, we at least ought to get paid for the risk. But the main problem was working conditions. A neighbor of mine was a controller at that time, and they came with an ambulance in the middle of the night and hauled him away in a wraparound coat. I still remember that. He had a complete meltdown. Okay. The controllers went on strike over that. Reagan fired him and told the public they were greedy. Okay. In the past year and a half, we've had two horrible airplane wrecks caused by air traffic controllers whose workload is beyond human capability. This is government ownership, so it's not a panacea. You need more than government ownership. And with that, that's probably the end of the rant.
Well, thanks, Tom. Appreciate that. Do we have any other railroaders that want to spotlight tonight?
I Tabitha,
Yeah, Jeff.
it's Jeff Kurtz. Yeah, I just have a few things that haven't they haven't really been covered a whole lot. If I could
Yeah,
go, no,
you
okay,
got the floor.
okay. One of the things that I really would like to talk about is the trip optimizer and the leader programs. They're mainly cruise control for the locomotives, and I'll start off with this story. It was the night before East Palestine happened, and we had had a labor chapter meeting, and we went out to eat afterwards. And I ran into some BNSF engineers that I've known for quite a while, and I was sitting next to one guy, and he was telling me what a mess that they've got out there right now with these long trains and everything. And he talked about the trip optimizer, that they were made to run trains. And he said that they tear trains up at least once a day. And I didn't hear anything else after that. That was like somebody hit me right between the eyes with a ball peen hammer. I had to I had to back him up. I said, Casey, I said, back up. You're telling me you tear up trains every day? And he said, oh, yeah. And he said, if we use the trip optimizer, um, we don't get in trouble. But if we're running the train and that train gets torn up, then we get severely disciplined. And so I talked to some, I couldn't believe this. So I talked to some other railroaders about it, and they said, yeah, we're tearing up a lot of trains. And if even they were only tearing up one train a week, that would be 10 times the rate that we used to tear up trains. Every day is just, I mean, that was just mind boggling to me. Um, so one of the things I think that they need to do is track how many trains they tear up. And they need to track if a human being was running it or the trip optimizer or the leader was running it. Because I think you'll be shocked to find that the vast majority of those trains are being run by something other than a human being. And as far as the in train forces in these long trains like this, any rank and file railroader can tell you that how powerful those forces are, because most of us have been knocked out of our seat at 2 a.m. in the morning, um, and it comes basically out of nowhere. Things with longer trains, I think laws of physics that we haven't even discovered yet are in effect on some of these trains, because like Tom said, you could be going uphill, downhill, uphill at the same time. You're going around curves in different directions with the same train. You've got sections of the train that are going at different speeds than other sections of the same train. And that's just a recipe for disaster. Now, I've seen the legislation that was written in this new safety bill, and I've got to tell you, I could never support anything like that. I've seen thousands of pieces of legislation written, and I can recognize when they're writing legislation because they don't want to do anything. And that is what they're doing with this long train legislation by commissioning these studies and setting times. A year from now we're going to do this. 3 years from now we're going to do that. If they want to make this legislation viable, what they need to do is say, they can say everything that they're saying in the legislation now, but they need to say, and in the meantime, we are going to restrict the size of these trains to 7,500 feet. So that is basically all I wanted to say. Thank you, Tabitha.
Jeff, do you mind to clarify which legislation? Because we've got several on our list.
Okay, this is the 2026 Rail Safety. I don't know if they call it the Rail Safety Improvement Act or Federal Rail Safety Act, something like that. But I could find the number. But yeah, it is that big omnibus railroad bill that they're writing that specify, like they talk about the law. They talk about I'm trying to think what else. Oh, well, they talk about block crossings and other things. But the block crossings part and the long train part, they definitely need to be revised, and there needs to be amendments submitted to make them worth the paper that they're written on.
All right. Well, thanks. We may have to get together and talk about legislation. All right, let me unspotlight you. I know Tom had another question, but I've got a handful of questions, Tom, if you don't wouldn't mind to keep it brief so we can get to the other folks.
Yeah, it's actually related to what he said. The trip optimizer, the computer that runs the locomotive, uh, does things that make no sense whatsoever. And one of the parts of train dispatching, as I've pointed out, that's essential is time and distance. And I used to look at the name of the engineer on the train sheet, the tonnage, the locomotives, and I knew to the minute how long it would take to go from this siding to that one, this station to that one. Now the dispatchers can't tell whatsoever. It's a wild guess because the trip optimizer may slow the train down for no reason, may speed it up for no reason. You don't have a clue. So you add that to the computer assisted dispatching systems that uh, were designed by people who had never been a dispatcher, the locomotive systems that have been designed by a person who's never been a locomotive engineer. And whatever it is that they call optimization is just garbage. And then the only other quick point is that in the talking about sidings, in the railroads that I've designed for new service, I've made sure that the sidings are at least 2,000 feet longer than the train because slow speed eats capacity. And I want to, in the work I've done, you have to maximize utilization. So I don't want an engineer crawling in at 10 miles an hour through a 35-mile-an-hour switch and then hanging on to his seat to make sure he doesn't run out the other end. I want him to head in at 35 miles an hour through a 35-mile-an-hour switch with a full service and come to a stop a comfortable distance ahead of time and save me 10 minutes of mainline capacity. And that's it.
All right. So first question I have, and I'm going to go back to gallery view, was from Steve Ongerth. For those who aren't rails, can you give a rough ballpark as to how many cars are in an excessively long train? Anybody want to give a go with the number?
Uh, Tabitha, I'll try to answer that if you like.
Go. Yep.
So the problem is there really isn't a good answer to that because what's a long first off, not all cars are created equal. So for example, where I work, there's a lot of what we call five banger trash cars that are technically for purposes of paperwork, one car that are the length of five cars. That's common on intermodal trains too, where it's basically a series of articulated cars that are permanently attached together, and they count as one car length on your train paper or one car on your train paperwork. The other problem is that it depends on the territory. I mean, in some places, it's the territory is going to mean that you can handle you can handle a longer train more easily. In some cases, not. So I think the real problem is not number of cars, but the length and then the weight of trains are is the important measurements. And of course, these aren't necessarily reported on. Like that special bulletin, those special bulletins I put out that, or I mentioned that RWU has put out recently. In the reporting around these derailments, some of the reporting mentions how many cars go on the ground. But again, are they intermodal cars? Are they, five banger trash cars? Who knows? And a lot of them don't report even total car counts, or the length or the tonnage, because basically there's no requirement for the railroads to disclose any of that information. Um, so what I would say is that, I think, like Ron said, a 2 mile long train used to be considered like a long train. Um, most of most of the stuff I've read about from sort of like the technocrat side of things, people who study all this stuff and write all these reports and have college degrees, is there's this 1.4 mile number that is sort of fixated on a lot, where that used to be sort of the standard. Even that feels long to me on some of the territory that I've been on. So I think the problem is there really isn't, and some of the attempts at legislation, um, like there was the New Jersey legislation that ultimately had its provision about train length removed, was aiming to make it 8,500 feet. Anything longer than that, you can't run it. But even that, 8,500 feet, I don't know the territory, but that seems like a pretty long train to me, in my experience. So, um, I think unfortunately there's no real quick and easy answer to that question.
Ron, I'm gonna pitch it to you.
Yeah, I would agree with what Brother Nick has to say. Um, it is a bit subjective, and there's two things at play here. One is the safety component. Can we run a 12,000 foot train safely over this territory? Can we run this 12,000 foot train efficiently? So if you're running on a double track railroad on flat terrain, a 12,000 foot train, uh, whether it's excessive or not, I don't want to go there. But that's a different animal than running that 12,000 foot train on single track through the mountains with steep grades and curvature and so forth. Um, and then again into urban areas like Chicago, and Nick referenced the amazing 13 or 14 part series by ProPublica 3 or so years ago. And, in Chicago, for example, where there's lots and lots and lots of crossings, or anywhere in the Midwest, an excessively long train can have to do with it doesn't fit anywhere. Uh, when I ran from Elkhart, Indiana into Chicago, we actually knew, if you studied your stuff as an engineer, the footage between every single crossing between Elkhart and Chicago, because you knew where you could fit and where you couldn't fit. So there's all sorts of factors that go into what's an excessively long train. Is this train going to block crossings? Is this train going to clog up the yard? Can it enter the yard without delaying Amtrak for hours? So there's the safety component, there's the efficiency component, and so forth. So it's a very complex question. Oh, and then last but not least, does it fit into the sidings on the subdivision? And so right now I'm in Portola, California, and the Canyon subdivision west of here, down the Feather River Canyon, the sidings are 6,000 feet for the most part. And so an excessively long train might be something more than 6,000 feet because it can't fit into a siding. So anyway, yeah, there's a lot to it. It's sort of subjective, and as Nick said, it's based on the territory and the circumstances. Um, but we, if we take into account safety, efficiency, and not blocking crossings, and plug that all in, I'm sure we could come out with a great computer AI program that tells us when a train is excessively long. But of course, the railroad industry is not interested in doing that. Over.
Yeah, I don't think we want to depend on AI for that.
I
The
was going
next
to
question.
suggest I could do it without AI.
Uh, let's try to do with everything without AI. Breck from Washington State Physicians. I'm sorry, I forget that's the acronym. Sorry, Breck. The question though, as I scroll back up to get what the acronym was, right? Is the Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility. Do any states successfully limit the length by requiring X number of sidings sufficiently long enough for all train lengths? And then the second question was, what legal process would allow eminent domain repossession of all interstate rights of way? Oh, that's a really big question. Okay. Do any states successfully limit length by requiring X number of sidings sufficiently long trains for all train lengths? Does anybody have an answer for that one?
I can't think of one.
So, as far as I know, there haven't been any state. Um, there have been attempts at introducing state level legislation that directly limits the length of trains, including that example I mentioned of the New Jersey signed into law a rail safety bill, but at the last minute, it had the train length provisions removed from it. I think part of the problem is that there's a, and I'm not a lawyer. I don't have any college degree, let alone a legal degree or a legal license. But one of the arguments that gets used by the railroads, lobbyists, and by the AAR is the idea that only the federal government has the ability to regulate train length because it's an interstate commerce issue. And I haven't seen any examples of states trying to end around that by doing as you mentioned, something like requiring a minimum length or maximum or minimum length of siding or something like that. Um, I think that's a very interesting idea. I don't think any state legislators have you know thought that yet. Um, but yeah, I may be wrong, but as far as I know, there isn't any example of that.
All right. I'm not sure. We didn't really set a timeline on this conversation, so I don't want it to go terribly long. So I've got three more questions. So, Jacob?
Just a quick response. That's really interesting that they would say that it's because of international, freight, but because railroads do that to other railroads, though. They sometimes say for trackage rights that you can't put anything on this train that is, 9,500 feet or something, or you'll be fined for it or something like that. So it's interesting that the companies can dictate that, but the states have a harder time, I guess, legally. But that's all. Thank you.
All right, let's go to the next question. So Breck had a second question regarding legal process. What legal process would allow eminent domain repossession of all interstate rights of way, i.e., take back the gift of a century ago? This is a question, and I hope y'all don't mind. I'm not a railroader, but this is actually a research project that Maddox Thomas is going to take up. So we don't, Public Rail Now doesn't have the answers to this at this time, but this is a research question that we have and we are working on. So I hope that helps to answer that question. If anybody else wants to try it, but otherwise we've got 3 more questions I have to go to. All right. Karen Niles asked, could Nick explain what the delay or opposition is to the Union Pacific merger? I'm gonna hold that one until we get done with the next question, which is more about long trains. Adam asked, something I'd be interested in hearing more about is the combination of long trains and outdated, unsafe cars, the DOT 111s, for example. What I understand is these cars were both involved in Lake Megantic and East Palestine. And at the investigative hearings about the EP derailment, it was mentioned that the NTSB recommended these cars be discontinued quite some time ago for hazardous materials, but perhaps discontinued in general. Nick, Ron, anyone? Jeff, you probably would be the first person I would pitch that to.
Um, what now, as far as the car types, you say?
Yeah, is
Is that,
so the combination of long trains and bad cars, how common is it?
oh, the thing is, the long trains amplify the problems that these cars have. And it's simply because of the in-train forces, the buff and draft forces, what we refer to as slack. Um, and when you're not running these long trains, then you can get away with a lot as far as the car types. But when they have defects, these defects are and that's with anything as far as long trains. Uh, if you have problems, I think Tom said something about that. If you have problems, they're magnified because of the long trains. So that would be my answer to that. Um, you're never going to have a perfect car, but you can solve a lot of problems by shortening the trains and getting rid of a lot of those in-train forces.
Thank you, Jeff. Tom?
There's two kinds of age. The tank cars were not necessarily structurally deficient. They were deficient for the commodities they carried. Um, there's a 50-year lifetime for railroad cars, freight cars. If you do ultrasound testing of the structure, it can be increased to 65. The brake systems are periodically rebuilt, so the brake systems are never as old as the car. So it's in the case of the tank cars, it was just a matter of uh, the tank itself. But when it comes to grain cars and box cars and intermodal cars, the age is less of a problem.
All right, thanks, Tom. Nick?
Yeah, I just want to highlight on the DOT 111 things. Uh, I think this is a really good example of what we're talking about when we're talking about the industry basically regulates itself and the weakness of existing attempts to regulate. So after East Palestine, the DOT and PHMSA, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, put out a safety advisory notice about DOT 111s. And this is the quote from it. PHMSA, uh, oh, um, we're issuing this safety advisory to re-emphasize previously raised concerns about the survivability of DOT 111 tank cars and encourage tank car owners and shippers of flammable liquids to voluntarily upgrade their tank car fleets to the newest and safest available tank car designs authorized for flammable liquid service. PHMSA is also urging rail carriers to consider the risks inherent in continued use of DOT 111 tank cars, flammable liquid service, blah, 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 blah. The summary of this is it is a strongly worded letter suggesting that the carriers and the shippers should upgrade to the safest cars. There's no requirement here. There's no enforceability. There is nothing saying you have to do this or there will be consequences. And that's because the FRA is staffed by industry insiders, in some cases, former rail management and rail executives like the current head of the FRA, Dave Fink, who used to own and run Pan Am, which in my state still holds the record for the largest criminal fine paid by a corporation because of a massive diesel spill. So again, the industry regulates itself. And what we have here is a strongly worded letter suggesting that the safest measures be taken. Does anyone think that the rail corporations are going to respond to a suggestion? I don't think so.
Not unless you're the stockholders.
I just put a link in the chat which demonstrates how the industry is actually involved in FRA regulations.
All right. Then Karen's question, could Nick explain the delay or opposition to the UP merger, and is it assumed the merger will occur?
If I understand this right, the delay meaning that it was not approved and they have now had to reapply. Uh, is that right? And then the second question being, is it assumed that it's going to go through? I think the second question is easier to answer than the first. Depends on who you ask, but certainly I think a lot of people assume it's going to go through. A lot of union officials explicitly assume it's going to go through. Now, they assumed it was going to go through the first time. And I think a lot of people in the industry who saw the huge amount of money that Union Pacific CEO Jim Vena threw at Donald Trump for his ballroom project assumed that that would just buy an easy pass for this. But of course, the problem is at the first hurdle, it failed and it got denied. And now they had to reapply. So I think everyone who's assuming that it's going to go through um, is assuming based on the idea that the rail industry is united behind this thing. And that's a very important thing here because there's now a coalition that includes the two other big class one railroads, plus a whole bunch of other big business associations for shippers and chemical producers and people like that who are opposed to the merger going through. So there's one faction of big business that's in favor of this, and there's another faction of big business that's opposed to it, and they're both lobbying, and they're both spending money, and they're both trying to, get Trump to put his thumb on the scales for one side or the other. So, and then the delay, I think that the short answer, because I think it needs to be short, and there's a lot of stuff that's been written about the initial rejection of the merger application that people should read, but it's kind of a lot of like technical um like incompleteness arguments. Basically, sort of the argument is that they didn't do enough of their homework. They didn't produce a complete enough filing that answers all of the questions. And I think there's a lot of people who have a lot of different interpretations about why it got blocked on these grounds. Is it due diligence? Is it, they block it once in order to make it look like it's, they're doing their job and then they pass it a second time? I don't know. I'm not in their heads. But I think one of the problems is that, or the big bottom line for this is not a rejection of it based on the idea that the merger itself is a bad idea. It's a rejection of it on basically technical grounds and you know fine print things. So it's not I think that's important to understand.
Hey, Bill.
Hey, friends. It's been a great discussion. Um, so, since we're in this like peripheral if issues area of the conversation, I found it quite interesting to hear from the shippers coalitions that they had, for better or for worse, according to what Jeff said, they had supported the first Rail Safety Act, and now they're against the current rails. They're being pressured actually by the Association of American Railroads to change their position without very much changes to if any changes to the legislation whatsoever. So I think it's interesting that the shipper coalitions are starting to experience the limitations of the for-profit. I don't even know if they would characterize it that, but the railroads a railroad system that's captive to maximizing shareholder value, and I think even though shippers did not have your back when it came to rail labor and the strike or the potential strike, um, I feel like there's some interesting, unlikely allies to pursue uh, in this. I think that a lot of the things that folks outlined in return has to impact service and reliability, and that's what they care about uh, a great deal. So and it would be great if we could, like in Washington State, for instance, reapproach the long train limitations with state legislation, and it'd be great to learn from other places that are doing that. So that's just a bit of thought from an ally. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill. Jacob?
Just real quick on that. So if it does get passed to from the STB, if they approve the merger statement, then it's not over. I think there's a grace period, a 30-day or something grace period where we could start petitioning, bringing up petitions to say why, this would be a detriment to competition or to safety or to labor. And I think that's where the real work comes in. And, kind of to Bill's point of creating these coalitions. I mean, yeah, I mean, if we are all on the same side, no matter what our background is and what our or real reason why we're behind it. If we have a strong coalition, I think we can actually defeat it. I think that's the point here that we want to get through. That's all.
I would just reply that one of the things that I've learned recently is that Senator Baldwin had some anti-retaliation language that she considered using a couple of Congresses ago that didn't get utilized, but that I think that we should uh, cons consider the fact that even shippers are afraid, just like short lines are afraid of retaliation from the railroads. And so one of the things that I think would be a point of solidarity, because I don't think we can just like, I don't think we're gonna win by just shouting or even petitioning the STB. I think we really need to create a noise in Congress and shift the public perspective. And I think that things like passing anti-retaliation or making sure that anti-retaliation language is part of the reauthorization that's probably not going to happen until next Congress anyway. That and making sure that, because how can we have a process that's legitimate when people can't speak without being afraid? I mean, workers know that, but now the shippers and the short lines know that too. Check.
Yep. Thanks, Bill. So we've kind of like veered away from the long trains into the bigger conversation of how monopolies rule our lives and take over our democratic processes. But hey, maybe that's a complete story for another day. I don't know, Nick. What do you think?
Oh, there's always more to talk about when it comes to the merger. The merger touches everything. I mean, it's an example of everything that's wrong with the industry. And I think that the ultimate connection to public rail now is that I think nobody should be kidding themselves about the idea that we're going to roll back the clock to the way it was in the 80s or before the PSR revolution or anything like that. So the only question is, the future of the industry, is it massive corporate mega mergers, or is it something different, something like public ownership? And I think that's the heart of the issue is we can present an alternative vision for the future where we have control. So yeah, I also had thoughts on a next possible focused discussion whenever PRN wants to do that, in terms of a hot button issue that a lot of railroad workers are talking about right now. Who knows if it'll be the hot button issue in a month from now, but if
Well,
now is the appropriate time for that.
pitch it. Throw it out there. Let's see what sticks.
Okay, artificial intelligence, quote unquote. It came up earlier, but it is really shocking. There's some stuff that's obviously already been publicized and is well known. So, for example, the waiver that allows the railroads to use automated track inspection technology more. But in the last couple of months, they started as rumors, and now it's basically confirmed that at least one of the big Class 1 carriers is now using an AI system as a nanny cam to monitor radio transmissions of crews, and automatically report them for rules violations and things like that. So real Big Brother type stuff. And then there was also a article in one of the industry rags where a CSX executive is waxing poetic about how awesome all of the AI implementation that they're doing now is. And so it's creating a lot of anxiety for a lot of railroad workers, pretty much across basically all crafts. Um, and so I think discussing it and how it relates to the sort of um, the profit drive, because I think that's the latest of what there is. There's even stuff in this article. It's fascinating about how they're using the AI to try to uh, cut down on like fuel maintenance, fuel costs and maintenance of individual vehicles and things like that. It's pretty gnarly stuff.
Well, anybody that wants to pitch in, thumbs up for a conversation about railroading and AI. I see one. Obviously, Nick, two, three. And if anybody else has other ideas, throw it in the chat if there's questions about railroading that we should be having a bigger conversation about. Because this has been a great conversation. It's 7:37 now, and we've kept a majority of people in the call. So it was of interest to most people who joined tonight. So thank you all for joining the conversation. There were so with regards to public rail now and public rail ownership, it's a big topic, it's a big conversation, and there's lots of the devil's in the details is what was in the chat. And so we have to keep holding that bright light for what we think is possible in the future. We know that this is a very big problem that we need to solve. Not only do we have the monopoly and the greed problem, but we also have like, how do we want to reorganize ourselves as a workforce, as a democratic people who know what's best for the workforce of railroading and for the industry of railroading, who have never spent time in a skyscraper office. People on this call have worked in the business. They know what's going on. And so they know how things actually work on the ground. So we feel, and I think RWU feels the same way, since this was originally their campaign, was that railroaders know how to do this job the best, right? They have the experience. So why can't they have some say in the way the industry is controlled? So democratic worker controlled railroading. And what does that look like? We don't know, but we have to create a space where we can dream those big dreams and create another world, because we have to believe another world is possible. Democratic is a word we need to push. In so many places, not just railroading, it is across the board. So, yeah. So, with no further ado, I'll let everybody go because it's about time to sit on the porch and enjoy the birds before they go to bed. But thank you all for coming. We're going to, this has been videotaped, it's been recorded, and so I will put this out in a day or two after to get it all together. I'm going to collect the chat and throw it all in there. Thanks, Jerry, for coming. Jerry passed a bill in Illinois. We might, if we want to talk about legislation and ways that we can not like get into legislation, but we could, sort of take it as a side thing. Bill's really good with the legislative stuff, so we might want to talk about like how we can get a little bit more involved in things that we can do, calling out legislators and asking for this bill or that bill or, pieces and parts of bills being thrown into something. Anyways, there's so much there when it comes to lobbying. I don't want to make you sick tonight. So, yeah. So, anyways, thanks all for coming and see you in about a month. Bye. Thanks, Nick.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. I just forwarded you a bunch of crap about the AI stuff.
Great. I can't wait to read it tomorrow.
Yippee.
AI might be another place where Sierra Club could partner because they're very much against data centers.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And especially in Illinois and Prairie Rivers Network.
Yeah. You guys
Yeah.
take care.
Yeah, you too, Jerry. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. Just turn this thing off, stop recording, and go home. Night, everybody.